because they were surrounded by hostile forces and they had resisted effectively. And then they had the psychological and, to some extent, historical benefit of their victimization by the Holocaust. And these elements created the impression that Israel could claim a large portion of the high moral ground because they were basically the victimized people, victimized by history, victimized by anti-Semitism, multiply victimized. That began to change in one direction when they prevailed so decisively over their neighbors. But what made it change even more fundamentally was when they, in recent years, have sought to use this hard military power to engage not foreign military forces, but foreign societal formations that are, in one way or another, seen as opposed to Israel. This started with the 2006 war in Lebanon, in which the main adversary was Hezbollah, the movement that had made life difficult for Israel when it occupied southern Lebanon and eventually led to the Israeli withdrawal. When Israel responded in 2006, they deliberately used a strategy of what they themselves described as, for every loss that we experience, we'll inflict 100 times the damage and the death. And this became known as the Dahia Doctrine when they destroyed the civilian section of southern Beirut, which had been associated with support for Hezbollah. And at the end of 2008, in the so-called Operation Cast Lead, which involved the 3-week attack on Gaza, they deliberately, again, used that kind of tactic to deploy their hard military power against an essentially defenseless people. They had the relative casualty totals suggest that 1,400 Palestinians were killed, 13 on the Israeli side. Approximately the totals that the colonial powers have had, the ratio of colonial casualties in the Western Hemisphere. Columbus boasted in his diary, for instance, that every Spanish soldier was worth 1,000 indigenous people. And so you had that kind of ratio, and among the 13, several were friendly fire casualties. So it was obvious that the Palestinians in Gaza had no relevant weaponry, no relevant, and we've heard a lot about the physical casualties, the 1,400 killed and the 5,000 wounded, which were, of course, very serious. But in addition to that, the population, 1.5 million people living in Gaza, 60% of them are children. And from all psychological and UN observation, the whole of the society has been traumatized by these periodic violent attacks. And then in 2006, January 2006, the people of Gaza elected Hamas to represent them, and this led to a hardening of the Israeli policies and led to the imposition of a blockade in the middle of 2007, which has gone on for almost 3 years, denying the population what it needed in terms of food, medicine, and fuel. And since the Gaza attacks of 2008-2009, it also hasn't permitted the flow of building materials necessary to reconstruct the damage done from those attacks. So Gaza looks like a war zone, like a devastated war zone, and when Israelis claim that there's no humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, you only need to look at the pictures of Gaza to see what a horrifying set of circumstances people have been living in. It always was poor, and it was crowded, but in this period, it's deteriorated significantly and in a tragic way in many respects. The entire population of Gaza, to some degree, has suffered from these tactics. And reports are that from 40 to 60% of the children suffer from acute anemia. Malnutrition is very wide, high levels of poverty and unemployment, and generally very depressed set of circumstances. Now, what happened this week with a group of 6 ships that were trying to deliver humanitarian assistance to Gaza was, again, a kind of repetition of the Gaza attacks in Operation Cast Lead. In other words, essentially defenseless people were subjected to high technology military forces. Casualties were exclusively on one side, and Israel claimed, in a way that only the American media reports, that Israelis were acting in self-defense, which is, if you have a very dark sense of humor, you can appreciate that. But self-defense, to the extent it exists in this sort of setting, belongs to those who are attacked, not to the attacker. And you can't launch there's a treaty. It hasn't been mentioned very much, but there's a convention called, what's it exactly called? It's a Rome Convention on the use of violence at sea, which was actually ironically adopted after the Achille Lauro terrorist incident of the mid-1980s, where Palestinians, terrorists, killed a lot of civilians on this ship, and it was a quite horrible incident. And this convention was passed and has been ratified by 156 countries. So it's and really clarifies the extent to which two things are unlawful. One is to use violence in international waters. The second is you can't establishing a blockade is itself an act of war, which is not permissible under international law except in situations of self-defense against a prior armed attack. So to apply that to a humanitarian mission of this kind is without any legal and moral justification whatsoever. The interesting detail here is, why would Israel do something that is so seemingly so contrary to its own national interests? The law and the morality are clear, but the politics behind this are very puzzling. And it still hasn't, because one consequence of this is to clearly alienate, probably permanently, Turkey, the one strategic ally that Israel had in the region. Another is to put the United States, its main protector,